Thank you.
You're welcome.
Once again, welcome everyone to the second workshop in the DHIS2 Web App Academy online edition in 2020. Hope you are all doing well and safe and staying indoors probably for the most part around the world. But we're glad that you could join us today for this workshop on web application development in the DHIS2 ecosystem. For those of you who were a part of our workshop in June, welcome back. And for those of you who weren't, that's totally fine. You can find all of the material online. I'll go over some of that as well. But we're looking forward to diving a little bit deeper into some of the more advanced topics of application development and how to build really robust and generic high quality applications for the DHIS2 ecosystem and how to share those with the community as well. Today we'll be diving into the last topic that we touched on in the June Academy or June workshop, which was working with the app runtime and data queries to fetch data from the DHIS2 API. We're going to touch on some of the more advanced features of the app runtime and play around with some of those. We also have a slightly different format than we did in the last workshop. We're learning as we go. And I'll be sharing a little bit more about that as well. Just to get us started, let's get going. So welcome. This is again the second workshop in this series. We've had a sort of a three-part series for this academy this year, trying something very different, and welcome your feedback now or in the future as you see how this goes. We had a first workshop, as I mentioned, in June. We then also had participants that were taking part in the full academy and looking for a certification, completed a project across the month of July. And then this is the third component, which is the second workshop. If you weren't a part of all three of those components, don't worry about it. There's all the material is available online and will continue to be available online, and you can go back and review it. And learn everything that there is to learn, as well as we'll be probably following up this workshop, this academy, in 2021 with another version if you're looking for that certification. So we'll talk more about that later on in the week. Looking now at what the day's schedule today will be like, and most of the days this week should be pretty similar to this. We'll start with the first set of introductions, review a little bit the July project that several people have submitted, and then talk a little bit about logistics for the week. We'll also do a round of introductions for everyone that's on this call so that we can get to know each other and have a little bit of a dialogue. We'll then have a quick 15-minute break. We're going to break up the 3-hour sessions this time around with a couple breaks. So we have 2 15-minute breaks throughout the day. That'll help, I think, to kind of break up the sessions as well as let people stretch their legs, take a facilities break, those types of things. After the first break, we will have a presentation that I will be presenting on advanced data queries and mutations following on from the content that we finished with in the last workshop. I'll start with a review of that content and then talk about some of the more advanced features of app runtime. We'll then have another 15-minute break, and then we'll go into something that we're trying that's a little different from the last workshop, which is breakout sessions. So we'll break into smaller groups, maybe 5 or 6 people per group, and we will discuss among ourselves and work together on the exercises that follow on that presentation. So the point of this is to help people that are struggling maybe with understanding the content or have questions that need answering, working with their peers, your peers on that in that breakout group to work through those challenges so that everyone learns and the people that are teaching or helping others are also learning themselves and solidifying their understanding and exchanging knowledge that way. We'll also have some of the instructors who I'll introduce in a minute going around to those different breakout sessions to help out with those groups and answer any questions that come up. And that'll also be the start of working on a few exercises that we've put together for today, and there'll be a few for each day that you can work on together in that group if you finish all the questions that everybody has, as well as you can work on those on your own afterwards if you'd like, and we'll review them tomorrow morning. Again, the workshop, the total schedule of the workshop is 4 days long, so it will be today, tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday, the same time every day, so from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. or 1300. That's Central European time. The DHIS2 is based in Oslo, so we base our times in Central European time. I know there are people across many different time zones here, so do your own conversion in your head. That'll be every day for the next 4 days of this week. We'll close on Friday with some more kind of sessions as well. Yeah, looking forward to this and working with all of you today and over the next few days. So now to introduce some of the course team. I'm second from the bottom left here, but my name is Austin McGee. I am a software architect and engineer at DHIS2 on the core team. I originally am from California in the United States, but I live in Paris, France, and sometimes visit Oslo, where the most of the DHIS2 core team is located at the University of Oslo. We're kind of an international and remote group here. I'll introduce a couple of people that aren't on the call yet as well, and then the people that are on the call today can introduce themselves. First here we have Christos. I don't think he's on the call yet today. He is on the far right. He is Greek, but living in Germany and working on the DHIS2 core team as well, particularly on the tracker applications. Then we have on the bottom left, Milagros, who is based in Peru and works with the core team specifically on mobile applications, so web applications that are focused on mobile use cases. So configuring the Android application for DHIS2, for instance. On the bottom center, we have Lars, who is one of the original engineers at DHIS2 and the lead engineer today. Probably most of you know him. Some of you may remember his API introduction, which covered quite a bit of material in June. And I think, no, it looks like everyone else is here. So I'll go ahead and start at the top left. Jan Gerke, are you there and willing to introduce yourself?
Yes. Okay. Hello, guys. My name is Jan Gerke, and I'm based in Germany. I'm another core developer working mostly on platform apps and the UI libraries. And I will tell you something about how to test applications and code in 2 days.
Great, thanks. Hendrik, you want to kick us off for the next one?
Yeah, sure. My name is Hendrik. I'm based in the Netherlands, also a core developer on the platform team. I work on a lot of different apps and also on the UI libraries. And I'll be telling you something about generic app development in tomorrow's workshop.
Great. Thanks. Wahed, are you here?
Yeah. Hi. My name is Wahed, and I'm based in Norway. I work on, right now at least, support material for developers, and I'm going to present how to submit apps to the app log on Friday.
Great, thanks. Simona?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Simona. I'm from Czech Republic, but I'm based in with the core team in Oslo. So I'm working on creating online learning materials for DHIS2 and also supporting digital academies. Looking forward to meet you all.
Great, thank you. Alice, I think, is next.
Yes, hi, my name is Alice. I'm French, based in Oslo, and I'm working as academic coordinator within his PUIU team. So I think I've been in touch with most of you actually. So welcome. Thank you.
And Mathieu?
Hi everyone, I'm Mathieu. I'm French as well, living in Oslo as well. and I'm coordinating the digital learning effort, specifically on the more on the platform side. So welcome to this academy workshop.
Great. Thank you. And I just want to thank everybody who's was just introduced for all of their work in helping to put this together. It's been a team effort, and we're also working on getting the next version of DHIS2 out to you as well. So they have some deadlines this week. I really want to especially thank the core developers who are here on the call today and will be helping to instruct this week for giving some of their time to help share some of the developer love for our DHIS2 community. Thanks, everybody. And now we're going to go around the room, the virtual room, and introduce all of our participants. So we're going to try and keep this really short if we can for each person that's on this call. We have quite a few people, but if you can, some of you may recognize this from the last time we came around. If you had a favorite food last time, feel free to say your favorite movie or television show or something like that instead, or your favorite food again if you'd like. But I'll go around the room and have everybody introduce themselves, where they're from, what organization they're working with, some of their background maybe as a developer or with DHIS2, maybe what they're looking forward to from this academy, and then your favorite food. So I think if I can think of the best way to do this is to start at the top alphabetically. And I think I'm going to turn on the ability for participants to unmute themselves. It's on. Great. Yeah, so maybe we can start at the top with Alfredo Muchanga.
Hi, my name is Alfredo Muchanga. I am from Mozambique, working on São Digitus. At São Digitus, he's Mozambique. I am DHIS2 implementer and software developer. My favorite food is Mozambican local food. Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Arafat.
My name is Arafat Hussein Al-Khashabi. I'm Yemeni. I work in WHO Yemen, and my background, I am an IT, but haven't been working in IT for a long time. So my specialty is safety and health, and now I'm doing my master in public health. My favorite food is mandi. It's rice with meat. It's from Yemen. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And forgive me if I mispronounce anybody's name here, but next I have Aung. Ong.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
Yeah, I am from Myanmar and I am working as a software developer, liquid ministerial head officer. So I joined this workshop and I want to learn DHIS2. Yeah, my favorite food is local foods called tofu nui. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Next on my list, I have Bakhtash Salehi.
Hi, everyone. I am Bakhtash Salehi from Afghanistan, working with the Palladium Group. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Having 8+ years experience in application development, mostly .NET technologies. I also support the implementation of the DHIS2 based Ministry of Public Health data warehouse since 2016. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next on my list, I have Carlos Jeje. Don't know if I pronounced that name correctly.
Yeah, it was right. So my name is Carlos Jeje. I'm from Mozambique, working with Mozambique São Digitus, and I'm a software developer.
Do you have a favorite food?
Yeah, local food here in Mozambique called matapa.
Ah, okay, great, thank you. Next is Carlos Alonso.
Hi, I'm Carlos Tejo and I'm from Spain. I am a software engineer with a special interest in linked and open data, and I work as the DHIS2 consultant, mainly working with the API. My favorite food is just fresh food.
Great, thank you. Next, I have Chamika. Yeah. Senanayak.
Yes. Yep, correct. Hi, my name is Dr. Chamika from Sri Lanka. I'm currently a medical officer attached to the Ministry of Health. I'm pursuing the degree in anti-health informatics at University of Colombo, and I'm kind of new to the a new developer. I have some experience in front-end web development, and also I've been involved with a lot of DHIS to implementing project in the past 2 years. And my favorite food would be Japanese sushi, although we are usually accustomed to spicy Sri Lankan food. Thank you.
Right, thank you. And next on my list, the name is Clement.
Hi everyone, my name is Banungu Adajo. I'm from Togo. I'm working for East West Africa. So I'm information system developer and DHIS2 implementer. My favorite food is Ibebedu. Thank you.
And Damien Scarlett. Damien?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good day, my name is Damien. I'm working in Belgium, but from Australia. I work for MSF, doing some e-health stuff, so with DHIS and Kobo and some other fun mobile data collection tools. Background, I've worked in ICT a lot, and favourite food, last time it was Vegemite, but now since it's summer, I'm into some spicy food, so good green or red curries from Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Vegemite a winter-only dish?
Sort of. It's better on a toasted cheese sandwich, and it's better when it's nice and warm.
Fair enough. Thanks. Next, I have Ibrahim Anam.
Yes. Hi everyone. My name is Ibrahim Anam. I'm from Yemen. I'm working as an information management officer for UN OCHA. I'm implementing DHIS and humanitarian tracker and support the implementation for the Ministry of Public Health. My favorite food is seafood. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next on the list is Fad. F-A-H-D.
Yeah, I'm from Saudi. I'm from Saudi. I live in Turkey. I'm working on another company. I was working systems engineer, working as a software developer. I'm working different foods. I think all foods of university and delicious. Maybe I think thank you.
Thank you. It was a little bit hard to hear you, but yeah, thank you for introducing yourself.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Next, I have Gerard Bisama.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Gerard Bisama. I'm from DRC, Congo. I'm based in Kinshasa. I work for IntraHealth International. I have almost 4 years implementing DHIS2, and I work most of the time on the project concerning interoperability to integrate DHIS2 with other platform health information system using API. So my favorite food is grilled fish and pondu. Pondu is a local food, is made of cassava leaves and palm oil. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Next on my list, I have Didier Iguereneza.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me very well?
Yes, very well.
Okay. My name is Giraneza Didier. I'm from Rwanda. I'm based in Kigali. I work for HISP Rwanda as a software developer. I've been working in software development for more than 4 years, I think now. We support Ministry of Health in DHIS2 implementation and DHIS2 development across Africa and the world, I think here. My favorite food is French fries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next I have, it looks like Josue or Jose. Jose.
Yeah, thank you. You just pronounced it quite well, actually.
Oh, thank you.
My name is Jose Mutabazi. I'm from Rwanda. I'm working for Clinton Health Initiative Access, just known as CHAI, in the program called Hepatitis. I'm software coordinator. And recently I've been working with HISP Rwanda as a software developer for about 3 years. And I just have almost 3 years or 4 years of experience in DevOps, software development career. And my favorite food is Super Dog Deluxe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next on my list, I have, it looks like Maurice Jr. Maurice?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. My name is Maurice Jules. I'm from Rwanda, working with HISP Rwanda. And I've been in software development for about 3 years now. And with HISP, we work with different health organizations, especially Ministry of Health, to support different DHIS2 implementations. Looking forward to learning a lot with you all. My favorite food is chicken biryani. I don't know if some people know it.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah.
Next on my list, I have Mukaila Laboja. I can't hear you if you're speaking, Mukaila. Seems like maybe your microphone is not working.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, thank you. I am Mukaila Laboja. I am a software developer, and I have been developing software for about 10 years, from 10 years now. So I'm working currently in HISP West and Central Africa, and I am a member of the team working on APIs using DHIS2. And my favorite food is rice and fufu. So thank you.
Thank you. The next one on my list just says NKM. Are you available?
Hi, I'm Sam Kasuzi. I think my daughter had logged on last on Zoom, so she used that. I'm Sam Kasuzi from Uganda. I have a statistical background. I've been working with the DHIS space since 2011, and that was during the initial implementation with the Ministry of Health with Uganda. I worked with CDC, had a Windows programming background, and then 2011 onwards moved into DHIS2 open source. So I've been supporting mostly DHIS2 implementations. With the last 4 years being in working with the Palladium group, supporting the implementation of the DHIS2-based data warehouse for the Ministry of Health. So I think my contract will be going up to the end of September. Favorite food has been mostly Uganda foods, but okay, with peanuts, G-nuts. However, also from Afghanistan, I came across kabli palau, which is raised with mutton. So that has joined the list as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, I have Pascal. Pascal, are you there? Okay, we will go on to Paul Gonzaga, and Pascal will come back to you.
Well, thank you. My name is Paul Gonzaga from Uganda, and I work with the social and scientific systems. my background is system administration, but I happened to work with USAID sites project in Uganda that's implementing the DHIS2 on behalf of PEPFAR. So I'm a newbie to DHIS2 and software development. I'm a beginner developer, and I'm hoping to learn more from this session. My favorite food is fish with anything else. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It looked like Pascal was able to unmute as well. Pascal, are you there?
Yes.
Yes, hello. I can.
He can be able to use my laptop. We're actually sitting together.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, my name is Daisy J. Pascal, and I'm an app developer, software developer in DHIS2. in DHIS from Rwanda. And
I think we muted one of you, so you should be okay.
Okay. And my favorite food is just the fish.
Just fish. Great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Linnigan, I think, is the next one.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Pete. I'm in the UK. I work for BAO Systems. I was originally a physicist, but I enjoyed coding a lot. So I started working with DHIS2 and working on coding solutions to sort of extend the functionality of it when needed for various clients. Worked with MSF and PSI and a fair number of others. And my favorite food probably still is pizza, but I do love pad thai as well.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Next we have Roshan.
Hi, yeah, I'm from Sri Lanka, representing Sri Lanka. I attended the last session also. So my basic responsibilities are I'm working as a researcher and business analyst for HISP Sri Lanka and doing contributing to training as well as monitoring and evaluation in Sri Lanka and the region. And my favorite foods hasn't been changed since the last academy. It's still spicy Indian food.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Next on my list, I have Sam Kasozi.
Oh, I already introduced. I was the NPK.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Next, Sergio Valenzuela. Sergio? No.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm Sergio Valenzuela. I'm from Spain and based in Madrid. I'm a telecommunication engineer and I work as a consultant for a Spanish NGO named EAS. And during the past 5 years, I've been working on projects as a DHIS2 implementer and developer. And since in the last workshop, I have already said my favorite food, I think I'm going into my hobbies. And since I was a child, I really like racket sports like tennis, paddle, and ping pong. So that's it.
Cool, thank you. Thomas Sala is next.
Hi everyone, my name is Tomas Sala. I'm from Spain, I'm based in Barcelona. I am working with MSF Spain as a health technician. I work in configuration and maintenance of DHIS2. My favorite food is paella. Thank you for this workshop.
Thank you. And we're getting very close to the end here. It looks like last but not least, we have Masawe. It looks like maybe he doesn't have, or they do not have the ability to use a microphone. It only has a video. So we'll say welcome, Masawe, as well. If you find your microphone or your microphone is reconnected, please feel free to introduce yourself or introduce yourself just on the Slack as well, which I will introduce next. I believe that is everyone. If anybody did not get a chance to introduce themselves, please speak now. You can unmute yourself.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Yes, my name is Sakibu Alassani, working for HISP Western Central Africa. Most of us a developer or implementer and on interoperability task. So now I'm splitting my time with the global team on packages development. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else not have a chance to introduce themselves yet? Okay. We will be moving on. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves, and it's great to have you all here. We'll be, as I mentioned, working in smaller groups later, so you get a chance to introduce yourselves to a smaller group of people and to get to know them a little bit better. And yeah, looking forward to that very much. So before we move on to some of the logistics for this workshop, we'll go over just quickly some of the July project that was completed by about 15 participants over the summer. Great submissions. I thought was very impressed with some of the solutions that I saw. And I will be going over some of the kind of common pitfalls or common things that seemed to be challenging from my interpretation of the code and the applications that were submitted later on in this week. But I wanted to take this opportunity to open up the floor if anyone has any feedback that they have for challenges that they encountered in building a full-fledged DHIS2 application, perhaps for the first time, perhaps for not the first time, maybe it has been many applications that you've built. And second question would be, what was easier than you expected and what was harder than you expected in that challenge? So no obligation to answer this question, but I'll open it up to 2 or 3 people that want to speak up. If anybody has any feedback or challenges that you encountered during that project. Does anybody want to start us off?
Well, hi, I'm Sergio again. In my case, I have already made a couple of web applications for DHIS2 before. But this time, it was the first time I was using the UI platform, so the UI components and so on. And it was pretty straightforward, but the main issue I had is that sometimes I didn't have examples enough to base my coding. And I have already told you in the last meeting, the one which we will use for reviewing the July project, but just that because everything after I got some explanation from your side, I was able to implement what I was trying to. So that's it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and just to add on to that, documentation and examples are something that we're looking at really building out, particularly after we release the next version 235 of DHIS2, which have a deadline for this week. So definitely looking this fall or this autumn to in the Northern Hemisphere to to work on building out that documentation and examples and things. So especially if there are specific components that you would like to see specific examples for, feel free to send those our way, open them as issues on the UI repository in GitHub. That would be very helpful. But thank you for that feedback, and that's a good thing to hear. I saw some other examples of that as well, so that was one of the things I was going to touch on later in the week as well. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have challenges that they encountered in the project, or something that was easier or harder than you expected in using the app platform or the UI core libraries or those types of things?
Hi. Is my voice clear or not?
Very clear.
Thank you. Actually, I have two comments when I worked on the July project. The first was it was really helpful to use the components, DHIS2 components with the front end, like the organization unit tree, which automatically loads the organization unit without any code or additional code to call the API. But there are some things I think should be improved in next improvements, like the organization unit tree order was not as the order of the order of the organization units loaded into the tree was not actually like the order in the tree when you build it on the maintenance app. But I think it could be improved. Another thing is the limitation to the API. So when I wanted this is the most important point, because we are limited to the API. So I needed some features which I couldn't achieve by using the pure API of DHIS2, like loading the comments. I wanted to load all comments. So I found I can use only data sets, data value sets to load the comments, but it didn't support the pagination or data filtering. So I encountered some difficulties using it. So I think maybe the limitation of the API is the most challenging part to develop an application which fits your need. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and that's again something that we're hoping to address, especially as we build more and more applications on this platform, is to consolidate the API into a consistent format that it's historically been built up over 15 years, and so we're really looking to stabilize and enhance that API so that it's standardized in an accessible way. Thank you for the feedback, and I'm glad that the UI libraries and the org unit tree, for instance, was able to make it easier and faster to develop that application. That's the goal. So thank you very much for that feedback. I'll just have it one more if anybody has any feedback, and then other than that, we can actually create maybe a channel in Slack, which I will talk about in just a moment, for anyone else that has feedback or things that they want to share as well.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, as for me, I got many problems when I was working on the July project, but the main, I got two major problems. So the first main problem, please, is the documentation, please. It was not as complete. I think it should be improved as.
Yep.
Hello.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm saying that I think the documentation should be improved. And the second major problem, as for me, is the remote connection. If you are in one instance and you want to use a data query to connect to other server, you are, I think currently it's not possible. So I think it is one of the major features that should be added.
Interesting. So just out of curiosity for that one, you're talking about using data queries to fetch data from multiple DHIS2 servers?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so I'd be very curious to explore that use case. That's not something that DHIS2 does out of the box. So it's something that, if that's something that is a strong requirement for you, it'd be very interesting to explore that for us, because we have not designed for that use case. It is possible. We haven't gone over it because it's not a standard use case, but it's definitely something that we can talk about. So feel free to reach out to me directly if you want to discuss that later.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers, thank you. And if anyone else has that use case as well, please feel free to add it to the July project feedback channel that I have just created in Slack. I'm going to go ahead and move on since we're running a little bit behind time, but thank you all for your feedback so far, and any more feedback is more than welcome in the July project feedback, and we'll be going over some more of the kind of topics that came up in those projects and the grades as well over the next week. Grades is a loose term, but basically just reviews of those July projects. Good. Let's talk now quickly about the tools that we'll be using this week. I think most everyone is on all of these already, but we're all on Zoom. So Zoom is the first tool, and we'll have each of the sessions for 3 hours per day for the next 4 days on Zoom. The other major requirement for doing DHIS2 application development is some kind of a modern browser. We particularly recommend Google Chrome for their developer tools, but you can also use Firefox, which works well as well. Chromium can work in some cases as well. We also support Edge in DHIS2, but usually we recommend Google Chrome as a developer browser. So that is a requirement as well. The third one is a github.com account. So if you do not have a GitHub account currently, please go ahead and sign up for one now. It's free. You can go to github.com. Probably everyone on this call has one, but we will be using GitHub for some of our tasks. The last one, or the second to last one here, is academy.dhis2.org. That is where you will be submitting the exercises, and you've been invited to that, the course that we're running this week on the Academy website. If you did not get an invitation to that, or if weren't able to sign up for any reason, please reach out to maybe the technical support channel on Slack, which I'll get to in just a moment. Which brings us to the course Slack account, and I'll show the link to that on the next page. But we are doing something a little different than we did last week or last workshop, in that instead of using the discussion forum on the OpenEDX Academy website, we will be using a Slack account, which I think will give some better feedback and responsiveness from the staff into those questions, as well as being able to interact with your fellow participants here. So the web addresses for these different tools and particularly the things that we're using for this course, academy.dhis2.org is pretty self-explanatory. You should have had an invitation to the specific workshop for this week, and that should appear on your homepage at academy.dhis2.org. We also have the Slack account, which you can see the address here. It's also has been shared with you, so you should be able to access that. If you can't, definitely don't hesitate to open up the chat in Zoom and let us know that you're not able to access Slack, but otherwise Slack should be the place that all of our communication and questions and those types of things should go through. Last one, or second to last one here, we have the GitHub repository, which is the same repository as we used for the last workshop, where we will be posting all of the material for each of our sessions over the next week. We'll post links to slides, and that'll also be where the code for each exercise will be located. And finally, we have a dedicated DHIS2 instance for this workshop. It's the same URL as the previous workshop. That is academy.demos.dhis2.org/app-dev-academy. And when you go to that URL, you can log in with the username admin and the password district, just like the Play servers on DHIS2. The reason we set up a custom instance here is so that we're not disrupting any of the demonstrations or developers that are working on the Play servers or the debug servers and those types of things, and we can mess with this and reset it when we need it. So feel free to use that for any of your applications, to point your applications at that instance or to install them there. That's our playground for this week. Does anybody have any questions about that, these links or the resources that we'll be using this week, or have any trouble logging into any of those services? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. Feel free to reach out on Slack if you have any questions about that. And the final resource here, which I shared last time as well, is developers.dhis2.org. This is relatively new, but it's becoming our central portal for all kind of developer-related content. That's announcements and news about developer releases, library releases, or good things to know that are new in the developer ecosystem. Talks about different upcoming events such as this workshop, links to all the documentation and guides that we have, which, as I mentioned, we're expanding significantly in the next months, as well as a link to the community of practice where you can outside of this workshop share any questions or comments or work that you've done in developing DHIS2 applications with the rest of the community of DHIS2. I'm going to go ahead and open that up now just to show you a little bit what we have here. So this is the developers.dhis2.org. So we have some articles that have been posted. For instance, just last week, I posted an article about same-site cookies and DHIS2 applications and how that affects, there's a change in Chrome and Firefox and how that affects the development of DHIS2 applications when you're running them on local hosts. So there's some workarounds here for fixing this issue in Chrome when you're developing, as well as some suggestions for how you might address it if it affects your production applications. This is just an example of one of the kind of articles or posts that we have on the long form posts that we have on the developer portal. We also have, if you click on this link up in the top right of this page, you go to the community, where we have also posted a link to that same article. But this is where you can also post any questions or comments or suggestions that you have and share and discuss with the community specifically about application development. We also have events such as this event that we're in today, documentation, and some guides to share as well. I think that's it for our introduction here today. We're going to now take a shorter break, maybe 10 minutes, come back in 10 minutes at 11:10, and we'll get started on the first content of the day. In the meantime, feel free to get up, stretch, use the restroom, whatever you need to use or do in the next 10 minutes. We'll be back here, and feel free to share any questions or suggestions or comments on Slack, or just introduce yourself as well. Really happy to have you all here again. Thank you all for introducing yourselves, and looking forward to the next few days. Thank you all very much again, and talk to you in about 10 minutes. Cheers. Thank you, Ali. We will be starting again in just a moment, and we'll be just waiting, make sure everybody's back in their seats and ready for the next session, which will be about data queries and some of the advanced use cases or features of the app runtime library. We'll start that in just a moment, and I will share my screen. Thank you everyone for the feedback that has been shared on the July project feedback channel in Slack. It's really appreciated and helpful. Okay, so we'll do about 40 minutes here of discussion about the app runtime. Feel free, if you have any questions while I'm talking, to post them in Slack on let's see which channel is best for that. Perhaps on the general channel is probably fine for that. Just to bring up any questions that you have as I'm speaking. If there's anything that I don't cover that you would like covered as well, please feel free to post it there and I can address it later on in the day as we get into some of the breakout sessions. We will be having a short quiz at the end of this session. There are just 2 questions, pretty straightforward. You can also resubmit that as many times as you want, I believe, and you can work on that with the group in the breakout session as well if you want to wait till after the break to take a look at that. But that will be based on basically how to use app runtime and how it works in functional React components using the use data query hook. We're going to focus mostly on use data query here today, which is for reading data rather than for writing data. I'll cover a little bit of review about what data queries are and what data mutations are as well. Most of the advanced features that I'll cover also apply to data mutations, but I'm going to use queries as the example here today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So just a little bit of review. We have a library called app runtime, which is included out of the box in the app platform if you implement a new application that way. And it provides a few different things. The one that's here on the screen right now is talking about the app runtime provider. Actually, the title is wrong here. Apologize for that. In most cases, if you're using the app platform for your application, you do not need to include an app runtime provider. That allows you to specify a base URL and an API version for all of the queries in your application, or specifically underneath this component in your application tree. And you can use that if you're building an application that is not using the application platform. We recommend, obviously, that you do use the application platform because it makes a lot of things easier and it helps us to push things forward. But if you're not using that, you can use the provider to specify those same configuration parameters that are provided out of the box by the application platform. This is also, as I think Michaela mentioned, if you were to use a second application app runtime provider, you could use that potentially to contact a different DHIS2 instance for certain data queries. That's a very advanced use case that isn't super well supported, but it is possible using a custom app runtime provider. I'm not going to get into that too much. Generally speaking, we talk about 2 different things when we're talking about app runtime and the data engine or using data in DHIS2 applications. The first is queries and the second is mutations. In general, queries are for reading and mutations are for writing. You can think of them also as they're analogous to some HTTP verbs under the hood. So queries use a GET request for REST API, and mutations use basically all the other request types. So put, patch, put and patch and oh man, why am I blanking? Post and delete requests across the network, if you're familiar with REST API terminology. You don't need to know what's actually going on under the hood of data queries and data mutations. That's kind of the whole point. And the idea is that if you use these, we're able to, behind the scenes, seamlessly do things like cache data locally in your browser so that you don't need to actually create a HTTP request if the data already exists, and those types of things in the future. Today, they do translate directly into HTTP requests. The other piece of the DHIS2 app runtime that is not covered very often, or not very well known maybe, but can be very useful actually, is allows you to access those variables that you set in the provider or that are set for you by the app platform. And those 2 variables are the base URL and the API version for now. There might be other or there will be additional configuration variables that are passed throughout your application using the use config hook. in the future, but for today it is base URL and API version. And this lets you anywhere in your application without passing a lot of props through all of your different components to be able to access the URL of the DHIS2 instance that you're talking to if you need to use that for something that isn't fetching data, for instance. It also lets you do things with the API version if you wanted to use that. A lot of times you won't need to use this, but it can be very handy if you need to pass the base URL to some other component or some other feature, functionality or library that isn't aware of the app runtime. But getting back to queries and mutations, as I mentioned, queries are for reading, and in order to read data from a functional React component in a DHIS2 application, we have a hook called useDataQuery. This useDataQuery allows you to declaratively define data dependencies and respond to loading error and data state changes. What that means in practice is that you write this one line down here, down at the bottom, and then it will basically re-render your component every time the state of that request changes. So if the network request is in progress, it'll tell you that you're in a loading state. If an error has occurred, it'll tell you you're in an error state. If you're finished loading and no error occurred, then you'll get the data that was the result of that API request back to your component. And I'll go into that a little bit more and how to deal with loading error and data states, loading error and completed states in a minute. This is the useDataQuery hook again, which is used for reading data from the API. And here's an example of a simple data query. You can use the playground runtime.dhis2.nu, which is where our app runtime documentation is hosted. You can also find that linked from developers.dhis2.org. In this playground, it is a DHIS2 application built with the app platform, and it allows you to basically to experiment and test out different queries and mutations and see how the real world results of using those against a DHIS2 instance. I will note that you'll need to add runtime.dhis2.nu to your cores whitelist in your DHIS2 instance if you want to use this against your own DHIS2 instance. You can also, however, install this application from the app management app in that instance. But if you're using this against a, like for instance, debug.dhis2.org instance, make sure that the runtime.dhis2.nu is in the cores whitelist, and also make sure that you've read the post about cross-site, cross-origin cookies and what that means for your browser and for your DHIS2 applications, because you will need to disable that feature in Chrome, for instance, in order to have an application be able to talk across different URLs. Just pointing that out, the easiest way to do this is to install the application from the App Hub in the App Management app in your DHIS2 instance. But here's an example of one simple data query. So this is using the resource me, which is just /API/me if you're using a regular API request. And we're passing just a single parameter, which says that the field we care about is the name field. So normally if you just do /API/me, you'll get a whole ton of different fields about the currently logged in user. We logged in to this playground instance, playground to a different DHIS2 instance with a specific user. And in this case, we're requesting just the name field for that user. So we specify the parameter of field with name, click execute, and the result, as you can see here, you have the name of the object that you're requesting. We said me on the left here, and it's me on the right. And then we're just getting the single field of name. It's a very simple data query. However, it can get more complicated because, as you saw, we had named that particular request for the me resource. So here again, we have a me resource, but in this case, we have two different parameters, name and email, and we also have two more resources that we're requesting in parallel. So a query can have multiple items within it. So in this case, we're requesting the me resource, the indicators resource, and the data elements resource, all within the same request. So the advantage of this is that we're actually spawning 3 different HTTP requests across the network, but they all start at the same time, and we don't render the result until all 3 have completed. So if you were to do this yourself, there'd be a fair amount of coordination involved to basically spin off all of the HTTP requests, wait on a bunch of promises, handle errors in any one of those responses, and make sure you don't actually render the results until all 3 have completed. That's done automatically for you with the app runtime. And in this case, you can see on the right here that we have 3 different sub items or sub objects in this JSON object: the me object, the indicators object, and the data elements object. And each of those has the result of that particular API request that we've specified here on the left. In the indicators case, we're using a collection resource. So indicators is the list of all indicators in the DHIS2 instance. We're selecting a page size of 2, so only 2 items from the indicator list. We're going to select the 3rd page, and we're going to select a few different fields. For the data elements case, we are selecting just an individual ID. So this is one specific data element, and it also has 3 params fields that we selected. The 3rd of which is actually 2 fields that are part of a sub item of this data element. If you remember the session that Lars gave at the end of last workshop, talking about how you can expand basically sub properties of or related resources from a resource in the DHIS2 API, you can do that very easily here in the data query. And the result that you get on the right here is that you get the indicators list and the data element, a single data element. Indicators list also has some pagination information. So it tells you that you're on page 3, that there's a total of 39 pages, total number of indicators is 77, and that our page size is 2. You can use that then to request the next or previous pages later on. Go ahead and go to the next one. I see that I might have a question coming in. Yes, that's a good point. Pete just mentioned that it's possible to have multiple filters, for instance. Similarly, you can also have multiple fields, as we saw here in this. As we saw here. So in a param, you can have a single string or number value. For instance, here we have page size of 2 as a param. But you can also have an array, and the app runtime will do the right thing. So it actually expands them differently into the URLs of the API for fields and filters. But if you have filters here with recent versions of the app runtime and you have an array, it will actually expand that into multiple filter parameters that it will pass to the API. It's a lot easier than trying to basically spell out a long API string with multiple filter parameters. You just say filter, and then you have an array with multiple entries in it. Thanks for that question, Pete. Getting on to mutations. So as I mentioned earlier, queries are for reading, mutations are for writing. You can declaratively define mutations, which means that you're telling basically the app runtime what you want to happen, not how you want it to happen. It's similar to what we just did with use data query, but there's an additional parameter that's returned. So it actually returns an array. The first one is a function that you can call to actually execute this mutation that's called mutate. You can name it whatever you want, but it's the first item in this returned array. And then you have 3 or 4 objects, or four parameters of an object, which are similar to in the use data query case. We have loading, error data, and a called state. And I'll get into what that does in a minute, because that's the same as doing a use data query with the lazy parameter. You pass the mutation, which I'll get into in just a moment, and some options to that hook. There are a few different types of mutations. As I mentioned, under the hood, this is translating to a request to the DHIS2 API. So if you use a create mutation, you're going to create a post request. If you use an update mutation, you create a put request. You can also create a partial update mutation, which is a patch request, and then a delete mutation, which will remove an object. So generally, if you're creating something new, you use a create mutation. If you're changing something that already exists, use an update mutation. Use a partial update mutation when you're only changing a part of something that already exists. So if you're changing only the name of a user, for instance, you should use a partial update rather than a full update, because if you use a full update, you need to pass all of the parameters of that user or all the fields of that user rather than just the name. I won't get into that too much. You can experiment and see how that works. It's also important to read the documentation of the API to make sure that the endpoint that you're talking to supports the patch or put requests for a particular endpoint. Delete mutation does what it says. It deletes the object that you pointed at. Here's an example of a mutation. So if in this case, we're going to create a new indicator. So we specify the resource is indicator, or indicators. The type is a create mutation. And then we pass it some data, which is what is used to actually create that indicator. We have the name of the indicator, short name. We specify an indicator type, which actually references the ID of another item in the DHIS2 data model. And then we have two other things, numerator and denominator, specific to indicators, which are basically specifying how this indicator is calculated from raw data. We pass this create mutation. If you're in the data playground again, you can switch from query to mutation and click execute, and it will give you a response that says whether or not that was successfully created. You can then use this in your application to give the user feedback on how they should change something. If they, for instance, are missing a field, or they mistyped a field or something, it should be returned as an error from the server that you can then display to the user. One question from Sergio here. Maybe you can cover later, but can use data query and use data vacation be used to interact with the data store? That will be covered later. That will be covered tomorrow. The short answer is yes. You can absolutely use data query and use data mutation to interact with the data store. You can use them. You can use this to interact with any API resource in the DHIS2 API. So anything that shows up in the documentation for the web API, you should be able to use a query or mutation to access. For the data store specifically, we'll cover, Hendrik, my colleague, will cover that a little bit more tomorrow. We also have an early release of a library specifically for doing persistence in the data store for DHIS2 applications. So that allows you to save, load, and basically persist information, whether that's settings or saved objects or that sort of thing, both to the user data store and to the regular data store, and to propagate changes to those objects across your applications. It does all of that for you. We're using that in a couple applications, not too many at this point, but it is available. It's called the App Service Data Store. I believe we'll cover that briefly tomorrow as well. So that is a mutation. Cool. Let's see where we go to the next one. Yeah. Okay. So now that was all review. We're going to get now into some new content. Before we do that, I think actually I'll do this first section, and then we'll take a quick few-minute break, since it's kind of a lot of information to digest. So we'll take a few-minute break after this first new content about handling loading and error states. So as I mentioned, when you use use data query, you get a few things back in the object that's returned by that hook. One is a loading variable, one is an error variable, and one is a data variable. For those of you that aren't that familiar with React and specifically with functional components or hooks in React, this can be a little bit confusing because it looks like you'll only ever get one answer from this function. The difference is that React will actually call this whole function multiple times. So the hook, the useDataQuery hook, can actually tell React to call your function again with different responses to that hook. I'll go through how that exactly works, but basically this means that every time this function is called, it will have a specific value for loading, error, and data, but it might be called multiple times. So the first time it's called, it's going to have loading set to true because it's loading a new value across the network. Second time it's called, it might either have an error or return the actual data to the data variable. And I'll show you how that works here. This is general React stuff, but it's important to know when you're using a hook like useDataQuery to access data in a React functional component. So the first render or on mount of this component, what actually happens? So the first time through, we send off our query across the network, which means we're making an HTTP request to the DHIS2 instance. And the result is that we've started that query, that request, but we haven't gotten a response yet. So we don't know if it's an error. We don't know if it's successful. We don't know what the result is. That means the first time this function is called, it's called with loading equals true. Loading is a Boolean variable. We have an undefined error and undefined data. This means that the first if condition here is triggered because loading is true. So we say if loading is true, we're going to return the string loading with ... ellipses. This means that the rest of this function, the if error and the final return, are not called on this first render of this function. The second time this function is called, so this means we call this function once to render a component, which means that we're actually drawing the string loading into the application somewhere. Then we've said that we've started this HTTP request across the network that might take 100 milliseconds, for instance, or maybe even takes a full second to go across the network, find the server, come back. And then you know at that point whether there's an error or you have a success and have some result to display. So the second render, you have two options. The first is if an error occurred on the second render, this whole function is called again and the values of those variables change. So loading is false, error is the name of, or the string of whatever that error is, or it would actually probably be an error object in this case. And data would be undefined still because we had an error that occurred. The other option would be if an error does not occur and the data actually loaded, we call this function the second time with a different set of variables. Loading is false, error is undefined because nothing happened, or no problems occurred. And then data is the result of that API request across the network. So in this case, the first two conditions, if loading and if error, are both evaluate to false, and so we don't return anything for those two statements. And then at the end, we return hello plus the name that is returned from this query across the network. This is just a kind of a general overview of how hooks and React functional components work specifically with useDataQuery. And it helps you to see that you'll actually get 3 different renders or 3 different versions of the same component or piece of your application by rendering this or by using this component. The first time you can get a loading state. The second time you either get an error state or a success state. And there are some more states that we'll get into in a minute. Yeah, we'll get into refetching, which allows you to go through more states as well after a short break. So I'm gonna let us take maybe 4 minutes break. So in 11:40, we'll come back and continue here. But in the meantime, feel free to ask any questions you have. Get up, get a glass of water or something like that. Let this sort of digest, ask any questions you have on the general. Thank you to everyone who's asked questions so far. And we'll be back in just a few minutes. Perfect. Thank you, Alice. We will now continue with some more advanced data query and data engine features. I'm going to start with the possibility of refetching data. So we mentioned earlier that you can have a loading error and data result from a use data query hook, but that only requests the data once. So that means that if you load a page with that component, as soon as that component is displayed, it will load the information or the data across the network from the DHIS2 instance. You then get an error or a data result, and that's the end of that's the end of everything. So that will then never change after that. It won't try to load the information again. If that data changes on the DHIS2 instance, you have to refresh your page in the browser in order to get that information again, or the new information. Similarly, if you have an error state, it won't automatically retry in most cases. Yeah, currently it will not automatically retry for use data queries that result in an error. We have a way to get around this, or to add the behavior to kind of update the information after the first load has completed, and that is called refetch. There's another property of the object that's returned by use data query that is a function called refetch, and as soon as you call that function, it will refetch the data, and then it will call the entire function again with loading and then error or data states. So as you can see in this function here, we have an error condition, we have a loading condition, and a data condition. This is just another way of writing exactly what we had in the previous slides. And then we have a button. So this button is disabled while we're loading, so we can't try to reload something that's already in the process of loading. And when we click that button, which the text of that button is reload, it will refetch the data across the network. So in this case, we'll get a loading state. It will have the ... rendered in this H3 tag. Then we'll get a either error or data state. So if we're not logged in, for instance, your error will return with a 401 or a 402 unauthorized error. If we are logged in, it'll say hello and then the name of the currently logged in user. If you then log in, if you were not logged in before, and click refetch, you will then get the data response with hello and name. And in between those two states, you'll have the error, then you'll have loading, and then you'll have the data response. So this is handy because it allows you to build kind of interactivity into your application to refetch information after it's already been fetched and rendered once. We'll get into some of the more advanced and interesting use cases of this as well, but even just as a basic, simple refetch exactly the same query over the network again, it can be handy. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So to get into how that can get even more interesting, we have to introduce something called dynamic queries and variables. And I covered this briefly last time, but not during the official app runtime session. I talked about it when we were introducing the exercise for this particular, for that workshop. But I'm gonna cover it in detail now today. So everything we've talked about so far, both the queries and the mutations, have been static, meaning they are defined once and then they never change. So if you define that I want the indicator with a particular ID, you will always get the indicator with that ID and never an indicator with a different ID. That's useful. It can be handy for instance, fetching all of the indicators, but sometimes you want to fetch only a single page of those indicators. So for instance, the first 5 indicators or the second 5 indicators rather than all of them all at once. Or sometimes you want to, you don't know when you're writing your code what ID of indicator you want to fetch. Usually you won't. And so you need to pass a variable or make that query dynamic so that it can be updated after the fact. There are three properties of the query that can be made dynamic. Those are ID, params, and data. So each of those, resource is not one of those, so you can't have a query that is fully dynamic. It will always be pointing at a specific resource for the moment. But you can have a custom or a dynamic ID, which means that the ID might change after the query is actually defined. And the way you make those properties of that query dynamic is you define them as a function, which takes a variable object as its only parameter, rather than as a primitive type. So in the examples we had before, I'll go back up here. Yeah, that's a good one. No, this is better. In this example, for instance, the data elements query in the middle, or at the third query in this query object here, we requested the resource data elements and the ID, this UID. If we didn't know this ID yet, we would instead define this as a function which takes an ID parameter and then returns the ID that we want to fetch. I'll show you how to do that in the next slide. So here on the left, we have a static query. So in this case, we're fetching, I used a number here in DHIS2. You wouldn't use a number for an ID, but this is just an example and it's a little bit easier to read. So in this query, which we've just called my query, we have two parallel requests. The first is for the indicator with the ID 42. So this means that every time we run this query, it will always fetch the indicator with ID 42. And then the second part of this query is a list of visualizations, and we've passed a filter to that visualization list. So in this case, we are finding all of the visualizations with a name which starts with ANC. Yeah, it has to start with that and its case insensitive comparison. You can find how filters are defined in the documentation for the API. It's different for different endpoints, but this is a common one, and it helps to, yeah, it allows us basically to do a search on those visualizations. But on the left side here, we're always fetching the indicator with ID 42 and the visualizations which start with ANC. And maybe that's not always what we want to do. Maybe we want to have a text box where we can type the search term that we want to use for our visualization list. Or maybe we are at a particular route in our application, which tells us what the ID of the indicator we want to display is. So and that might be 64 instead of 42. The point is that these, if we write these into our code, they can never be changed. And oftentimes in DHIS2, things are very dynamic and they might change on the fly. So on the right, we have the same exact query, but written in a dynamic way. So you can see that instead of the ID being the number 42, the ID is a function which takes an object with an ID property, and then it returns whatever that ID property is. This might seem a little silly to have an object with the ID property, but I'll show why that's necessary in a minute. Because we also have another variable which we can pass, which is called search term. So if you look at the params property or field of the filtered visualizations query, you have another function which takes an object, which is the variables object. And this time we're passing the variable search term, and we're using that instead of ANC when we're generating that filter. So this basically lets us do, if we pass the variables ID 42 and search term ANC, we'll get exactly the same query as we did before, but we're not sort of locked into just that ID and just that search term. So how do we actually use those variables once we've defined that query? So in this case, there are two different ways to do that. The first one is when that component mounts. So when the use data query spawns its first request. And in that case, we have this use data query call again with the my query, which is defined as what we had on the previous page. But then we have a second parameter to this use data query hook, which is an options object. And the variables field of that options object has an object with the two variables that we defined in our query, the ID, which is set to 42, and the search term, which is set to A and C. So in this case, this will be identical to the case where it was a static query, but we have the option in this case, for instance, to take the ID as a as a prop to our component that is rendering this hook, or the search term as a prop from this hook, or we could pull it in from state, for instance, as well. There's a few different ways to go about that, but this allows it to be dynamic, so it doesn't have to be defined when we're actually writing our code, which we'd almost never want to do. And the second option is to pass new variables to a query when you call refetch. So if, for instance, you press a button and it gets to the next page, you might refetch with a different page variable and pass that to the params of your query. Or in this case, we're just calling refetch with the two variables that we've defined, ID and search term. And in this case, we're just calling them with 42 and A and C, but we might call them with something different later when we call that refetch. And then as we saw before, the React component will re-render or recall that function with new data, error, and loading variable states. This is really powerful because it allows us to have basically define the way our UI reacts to changes in data and changes in state, and then to actually trigger those changes in a declarative way. In the refetch component, or the refetch call, is actually imperative, but I won't get into the distinction of that too much. Yeah, this is a very, very powerful and possibly confusing function of the use data query and use data mutation hooks, but hopefully it's very useful and powerful for your applications. I'm going to look. I thought we saw. Oh, here we go. Yep, I saw Pete had a. Yeah, I'm gonna get into that in a minute, Pete. Thanks for asking that question. His question was, if you use the lazy property of the use data query, which I'll cover in just a minute, do you need to pass initial values for the variables object? Technically, there is no, we don't enforce anything about that variables object. So you could, even if you're not using a lazy query, which I'll get into in a minute, you don't need to pass any variables to that function. You'll just get your, basically your query, the dynamic parts of your query will be called with an object, an empty object in that case. So search term would be undefined and ID would be undefined. And obviously that probably wouldn't work for this particular query, but you could also have, you could set these to be, have a default value, for instance, in this function. So ID you could say ID equals 42 here, and that would set a default value of 42 whenever that ID was undefined. Similarly for search term. That's one way to go about it. It's not required to pass variables when you first load, and it's definitely not required when you have a lazy function. Thanks, Jan Gerke, for responding to that as well. Next, I'm going to talk about pagination, which we again covered briefly or kind of tangentially in the exercise for the workshop last time. And specifically what we have here is how do we use those dynamic queries that we just learned about to paginate data? So to say, I want all the indicators, but I don't, if there are 1,000 of them, I don't want to load all of them at the same time. I want to load them 10 at a time, for instance, and then get 10 and then have a button that clicks next and see numbers 11 through 20 and click next and see numbers 21 through 30, etc. So we can see that actually in the this example, which is from the workshop last time, and we'll do this example, this exercise again, particularly working on the bonus question for those of you that didn't complete it last time, or didn't attempt it because it was a bonus question that wasn't required. We'll do that again later today. But if we look here at this pagination example, so we have here a paginated visualizations table, which has a query. And this query has a dynamic component. In this case, our params component of this query, it takes a single variable called page, and then it returns, basically it sets the parameters based on what's passed in there. So page is set to whatever is passed in, page size is always 5, and the fields are static as ID, name, and description. So here we could also, as Pete kind of pointed out, we could say page equals 0, so that if we don't pass variables when we first initialize our query, it will initialize to 0 automatically. Instead here, when we actually use our data query, we're setting page to 0. And then when we refetch, which is in a different component, we will actually change that page number. So here we have what we call pagination controls. It's another component. You could also define this in the same component, but it's a little bit cleaner to put it somewhere else. And we have two props that we're passing to that component. One is the refetch function, so that component can refetch this query. And the second is the pagination details. So as we saw in one of the examples earlier, when you request a paginated response from a collection resource in the API, you get two things. You get the pager, which has the current page, the total number of pages, etc., as well as the actual data that for the current page. So in this case, we're passing the pager part of that to this pagination control so that we know what the current page is and what the total number of pages are. If we go back to our components here, we can look at that pagination controls, and we can see that we're getting this pager from the parent component. From that pager, we get page and page count, so the total number of pages. And then we use both of those to figure out how to render these buttons and what to do when we click them. So we have 4 buttons. The first is called first, so that goes to the first page, or page 0. Page 1, sorry, not page 0. Then we have previous, which goes to the previous page if we're on a page that's after the first page. Next goes to the next page, and last goes to the last page. Fairly straightforward. You can see that we're disabling these buttons in certain situations. So for instance, if we're on the first page, we should disable the first button because going to the first page from the first page doesn't do anything. Similarly, if we're on the first page, you can't go to the previous page from that. So we'll disable it in both of those cases. And that you can see we're doing here when page equals 1, we're disabling this button. Similarly, if you're on the last page, so if the current page equals the total number of pages, then we're going to disable the next and the last buttons. And finally here, we're on the on first, on previous, on next, on last functions that we've defined here. Basically, they call this refetch with new variables. So if you remember in the component that is the parent of this one, the query was dynamic and it took a page variable. So in this case, we know the current page, and we know that when we click the previous button, we should refetch that query with the page -1. So the previous page to the current one. Similarly with next, first, and last. And this was the one of the assignments from the last workshop, the last day of the last workshop. Finally, here we have just in the middle of these buttons, we have a span, so just some text that says we're on page current page of total number of pages. It's just kind of nice, and it shows us where we are in this pagination. So this basically lets us use that dynamic query for a paginated collection to build a control that lets us move through a large number of resources without loading them all into the browser or displaying all of them. And it lets us do that in a declarative way. So we're not calling things and waiting for them to fetch and then reload, re-rendering. That's all taken care of by the app runtime behind the scenes. Feel free to ask any questions you have about pagination, which is a pretty common pattern in Slack or on the community of practice if it's at a later time. You can also refer back to this example. There are more sophisticated things you could do and better UI design that you could have for these types of paginations. And we are actually going to be adding a paginated data table component to the UI library at some point in the future. But for now, this is a good reference for building your own pagination into DHIS2. Going back here, so that was just an example of pagination, which is one of the major use cases for dynamic queries. Now we're going to talk about lazy queries, which was brought up briefly earlier. What does lazy mean? So lazy means that we're not going to fetch the information for this query when the component first loads. So when a component mounts or it first renders in a normal situation, it will automatically say, I don't have the data that I need to show information for this component. So I'm going to go and get it across the network. And I'm going to set the loading state initially, and then I'm going to set error or data when that comes back. If it's a lazy query, which is an option that we can pass to the use data query hook in the second object, just like the variables, then I'm not going to do anything when this component first mounts. I'm going to let you render whatever you want without any data or loading state or error state. And then once a refetch is called at a later time, then I will start loading and then return either an error or a data state. So queries are optionally lazy. So it's an option that you can pass to the use data query hook. Mutations are lazy by default. So you could actually pass lazy false to a mutation and it would run when you when that component mounts. I wouldn't recommend that. But they're lazy by default, which means that when you use the use data mutation hook, it won't do anything until you call the mutate function. That's an important distinction. So if you just have a use data mutation hook, it's not going to do anything out of the box until you call the mutate function at a later time, usually when the user does something like click a button. The definition, as I mentioned, of a lazy query is that it won't start loading until refetch is called at a later time. And then the final piece here is that we have another returned property of this object from the use data query hook, which is the called variable, and that will be false until the loading starts. So once we call refetch for the first time, then called becomes true. We can use that in a kind of cool way. So when refetch hasn't been called yet, which means this button that we're defining here at the bottom hasn't yet been clicked, we can say something different in this text, which says click the load button, and then the load button needs to be clicked before anything happens. We can also change the text of that button so that if we've already called and fetched the data once, we change the text to refresh. Otherwise, we have the button say load. So the first time it says load, you click on it, it starts loading, and then you get the ... and then either an error or a data state. This is a lazy function, and as Pete mentioned, you do not need to pass variables to this use data query hook if it's a dynamic query, but you would need to pass those variables to the refetch function when you call it if they're required. That's the lazy property or option for use data query. Does anybody have any questions about that? Do we have? Pete had a question or a comment here. Some endpoints don't include paging by default. that is true. So you do have to add additional properties there. So that's a good point. Yeah. So you might need to pass some pagination, different properties to get pagination to work with different endpoints in the DHIS2 API. Most of the metadata endpoints should have the same pagination behavior as we saw in that example. Async callbacks. I believe this is the last kind of secret feature or something like that of use data queries that we'll talk about today. And that is basically what it allows you to do is to react to, that's a joke, but to respond to the state changes that happen by default in the use data query. So in this case, we're calling use data query with a query, and we're only caring about the loading state at the end. So in this case, like probably this wouldn't be a very interesting component to render, but it serves our purposes here. So if where the fetch for the me endpoint is in the process of loading, we return a ... And once it's done, we just say done. So we don't do anything with the data. We don't do anything, don't handle any errors in this component. We just say we're loading. All right, we're finished loading, whether that's an error or not. What we do have here is two callbacks that we pass to the options object of this use data query, which allow us to respond when there's an error or when the request is completed. So on error, we can show an alert if there was a function called show alert, which I should have put as a prop passed into this component. But basically that would, somewhere else in the application, it would show an alert that says an error occurred with the error message. Similarly, when the request or the query was successfully completed, we could show an alert for that hello name. So in this case, we're rendering a component that shows us when we're loading and when we've completed or finished the loading, but the actual reaction to the error or success states is showing an alert somewhere else on the page. So this is just one way to use these callbacks. You can also use these same callbacks even if you have the full loading error called and completed state transitions in your component itself. You can still use these to catch or pass callbacks around if you need to respond to changes in the query state. So that is the last kind of advanced piece of the use data query that we'll cover today. We're going to get to a second break here in a minute so that I can get some water and stop my parched throat. But first, I want to talk about even more advanced usage of the data engine. The data engine is basically underneath all of the hooks and the components that you can use to fetch data from the DHIS2 API is a class or an object called the data engine. You can access this data engine with a hook called use data engine, and that will give you the instance of that data engine and it has two methods that we care about. Those methods are query and mutate. So this is a way to pass around the engine to places that are maybe outside of React or respond, or like event handlers that are somewhere else in JavaScript code that aren't able to take advantage of the declarative nature of the use data query and use data mutation hooks. You can then use the query and mutate functions imperatively or methods imperatively on this object. So engine.query is the same as use data query. It returns a promise, so it will resolve to the result of that query, or it will reject an error with an error if that query fails. You can also use the mutate function to do the same thing for a mutation, which also returns a promise that resolves to the result of that mutation or rejects if the mutation fails. If you don't know what promises are, don't really care about this. This is fairly advanced stuff. It's particularly useful if you're using something like Redux for your application state management. That's mainly the use case here, but there are a couple other places where this might be useful. There is an example in the app runtime documentation for using data engine in Redux as well. In most applications, we find that Redux is not necessary. We do use it in some of our more complex and advanced applications, but in most cases, most of the state for an application actually comes from the state of the queries themselves. But it is possible to use the data engine in an imperative way in a Redux context, in an action, for instance, or sorry, in a reducer potentially. Actually, it'd probably be in an action because it would have to be in a Redux func. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. But it's also important to note that you can pass queries and mutations and also the options object. So you can pass the variables to a dynamic mutation in this way. You can also use the engine to do sequential requests. I would recommend that you do them declaratively if possible, so you actually can sequence the rendering of different components if you need to have truly sequential or in series requests, and we're working on ways to do that in a declarative way, nicer ways to do that declaratively in the future to chain requests. But as Jan Gerke did mention, it is also possible to use the engine, which incidentally is also returned from the use data query and use data mutation hooks. You can use that to sequentially do additional requests on your, within a component. So this is a fairly advanced topic. There's more information in the documentation, or feel free to reach out to us if anything's confusing or you have any questions. But yeah, this is probably the most advanced topic for the data engine that you can think of. I believe that brings us to the end for today. Yeah, so that's the end for today. We're a little bit behind time, but we're going to do another 10-minute break before coming back to, or maybe 15 minutes. Let's do 15 minutes. So, or 12 minutes. Let's do 12 minutes. So we're going to come back at 25 after the hour, whatever hour you are at, unless you're in some places where you're at 25 past the half hour. But in 12 minutes from now, we'll come back, and feel free in the meantime to get up and stretch, get some water, use the facilities, or ask questions as well if anything didn't make sense. And we'll come back and have some exercises and a quiz for you as well after the break. Thank you all very much, and talk to you soon. Session. What we're doing in these breakout sessions is a couple things. So first, we will have 2 quizzes, which are very low pressure, but just kind of to test some of the knowledge and see if we're teaching things in the right way. For the things that I just covered in the slides or the presentation in the last 45 minutes. And the 2 quizzes there are, there's one on the left here that says App Runtime Basics, which is basically testing the knowledge from the last workshop that I also covered in the review section of the presentation. And then the second quiz on the left here is Advanced Data Queries. And so both of these have just one question. There are multiple, you need to select multiple answers for each of these questions. So it's not a single choice, it's a multiple choice response. And for both of these, the question is the same, the component is different. And the question is, given that component, which of the following is not a possible sequence of render results? So you have this simple component here. You have to think about how this component is rendered when it's loading, when it has an error state, when it has a data state, etc., and what the possible sort of sequences of the render result is, the returns of this function. and then you select the ones that are not possible, that can never happen. So if you select those here, there should be more than one in this case. And the question is exactly the same, but the component is more complicated in the second quiz. So in this one, you have more options as well. It's a more complicated component, but the question is exactly the same. So you have to think about the logic of how this component works, how the hooks work, how the state changes work, the lazy property that we talked about in the presentation, and then select these options that are impossible. So the ones that will never happen with this component. And we're going to do that as a group in the breakout sessions that will start in a minute. We also have currently 2 tasks, and there will be a 3rd task coming soon. If people work quickly, let me know, and I'll make sure that I get that up for you. But there are 3 tasks that will be sort of assigned for this workshop. We'll have a little bit of time in the morning tomorrow to go over these with Q&A and to finish the submissions if you don't have time later today to work on them, but you're welcome to work on them both in the group session as well as independently after 1 o'clock or in about half an hour when we break for the day. So there's 3 submissions. If you are a part of the workshop in June, the process is identical, and the content or the logistics of opening a code sandbox and forking it and then copy and pasting the shared version of that code sandbox, which I'll show very quickly in just a moment, are the same. And then you just copy and paste the link for that code sandbox with your response into this submission box. So we have 5 in total here today. So the first is App Runtime Basics. It's a quiz. The second is Advanced Data Queries, another quiz. Both of those are multiple choice. And then we have 2 to 3 task submissions. So we'll start with, I'll announce the first 2, or I'll share the first 2, and then the third one I'll share towards the end of this session. So the first one, second one, and third one each have a space for their own response. Everybody has to submit these independently, but you're welcome to work on them as a group if you'd like during the breakout sessions or separately. You're also welcome to discuss, so long as you're not sharing exact answers, you're welcome to discuss questions that you have on Slack during this time. To find out what these actually are, you need to go to the Workshop 2 folder of this GitHub repository. So it's the same GitHub repository as the last workshop. It was shared in the on the Academy website as well. It's under the resources there, I believe. And you can, yeah, let's see if we can actually show that in one of these. Where is this? Yeah, here we go. So it should be available here. So on the right side, you have the GitHub repository here. We're going to go there. And then click on Workshop 2. This has everything we're doing here. We're going to click on Advanced Data Queries, which is what the session we just talked about. It has some links, some information, has the slides that I presented. We'll be adding the recording at some point in the next day. And then we have 2 of the 3 exercises. So this first exercise here is pretty simple. There's a simple code sandbox that we've set up. You can click this link. And your task is to pick one of the advanced data query functionalities that we presented today, that I presented today on one of those slides. The slides are up here at the top again. And then just implement a component, literally any component that uses one of those features of the use data query hook in that code sandbox. So just to refresh, and there is, if you go back to the main page of this GitHub repository and click under resources, code sandbox, you can find a guide for how to use this code sandbox. I'm going to share all of these links in Slack as well so that everyone has them. So this is the Code Sandbox instructions, and it goes over in great detail how to use Code Sandbox, how to share the link that you need to submit that project. When you're ready to work on this particular exercise, so for instance, for exercise 1, we'll click this simple Code Sandbox link. It will then open like a predefined task or a predefined repository with all the code that you need for doing this project. If you then go, so the task again here is to use any advanced query technique from today's presentation in the advanced query component.js file. You can find that file on the left here, advanced query component.js. There's nothing in this component yet. You need to fill it in with a query and some advanced usage of use data query. Remember that there is a DHIS2 instance available to you. So if we go, it's also linked on that on the Academy site, and I'll also post it into Slack. But this is the URL that you're going to be using. So you can use that in your Code Sandbox. And I would recommend maybe to click this button on the top right here to go to pop this out into another page, but you can also do it right within the Code Sandbox. We're going to put that URL into the server box for this app. We're then going to use the login and password admin and district. Click sign in. If you, so this obviously the challenge here, the error here is that this component is broken and it doesn't work. So you need to fill that in. You need to fix it. That's why you're getting an error here, and you can see the details of why that is as well. Nothing was returned from the render, which is the correct error in this case. But once you've completed this project, this should show your application here as well. If you have problems with logging into the Academy instance or anything with Code Sandbox, feel free, don't hesitate to post in the technical support channel on Slack or reach out to me directly. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Alice, who will spend a couple minutes to split us up into breakout rooms. We'll spend the next 30 minutes or so, 25 minutes, we'll say 20 minutes in those breakout rooms. You can do the quizzes together and then start to work on those 2 exercises. And then we'll reconvene for the last 5 minutes before 1 o'clock, for the top of the hour, to just go over what's going to happen tomorrow morning. If anybody has any questions, feel free to post them on Slack as well. Alice, does that work for you to split us up into breakouts now?
Yeah, just give me 2 minutes.
Yeah, great. So she'll start working on that. You will in Zoom, you will be pulled out into another room with a few of your colleagues, and you're welcome to discuss and talk to each other and discuss the quiz or the content, or ask any questions that you have. And the instructors will be coming around to those different breakout rooms to help out as well. Yeah, thank you all very much again. And let me know on Slack if you have any questions. No questions. So I'm going to post those links as well in the general channel.